All right, then here we are with our second video on George Gershwin's Someone to Watch Over Me. You might recall our first video was a complete analysis of the 1926 sheet music by George Gershwin. In this video, I'm going to talk about chromatic reharmonization. Actually, I'm just going to talk about a couple of measures in the piece, but that will be enough to talk about things like circular progression, secondary dominance, tritone substitution, and chromatic linear progression. I think you'll find that these will all be really useful tools in your reharmonization toolbox. Anyway, I'll play the piece first to remind you of what it sounds like, and then we'll jump right in. As always, when we do an analysis, we're going to want to write out all the diatonic chords within the key first, so that we'll have a nice little handy chart. Then we're going to want to rewrite this chart so that the chords are actually tracing around the circle of fifths, because we know a lot of times this is what harmony does. E flat major 7, A flat major 7, D half diminished 7, G minor 7, C minor 7, F minor 7, B flat 7, and back to E flat major 7. Let's put the Roman numerals in for those last few chords. Now, as I said, we're only going to look at two different sections of this piece. One is the very first measure, and the other section is the last two measures of the A section. That is, the measures that are underneath the first ending. But before we look at them, we should talk a little bit about chord scales. Chord scales tell us what melodic notes are possible with different kinds of chord qualities. You really can develop these scales just by using your ear and building the chords up in thirds above the chord basic qualities. So for example, the C major 7 chord. Build it up to the 9th, the 11th, and 13th, and see what pitches seem to sound good. Most people would say that in this case, the sharp 11, or the F sharp here, sounds a little better than the F. So we'll build our chord scale with that pitch. The scale ends up being a Lydian mode. When we build a chord scale above a dominant 7th chord, we build the 9th, the 11th, and 13th. Again, the sharp 11th seems to sound a little bit better. That's a Mixolydian scale with a raised 4th. What's interesting about the dominant 7th chord quality is you can add all kinds of tensions to it. A sharp 5, which is also the flat 13, a flat 9, and a sharp 9. By the time you add all those tensions together, you've really almost included all the notes of the chromatic scale, except for two pitches, the perfect 4th and the major 7th. So in some ways, it's easier to think of the notes that don't match the chord rather than those that do. The minor 7, we build it up to the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th like this. And here's our chord scale. It's a Dorian mode. And here's our fully diminished 7 chord. We build it up with a 9th, 11th, 13th, and some would even call that last note a 15th. Notice that I spelled the diminished 7th of this chord as a 6th. That's just to make it easier to build the chord scale. And if we put all those notes together, we get a diminished scale. Whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, half. And finally, we try one on the half diminished chord. We add a 9th, an 11th, and what ends up being a lowered 13th. That's just a minor scale with a lowered 5th. Alright, now that we've talked about chord scales, let's go ahead and look at this. This is the first ending, the last 2 measures of the A section. This is what I'd call a turnaround. In other words, it's the end of the phrase. It's a series of chords that is just intended to get us back to the beginning of the piece, which of course is an E-flat chord, and it usually ends on a dominant chord. So what we're going to do is take a little bit of a lesson that we learned in our diatonic reharmonization, where we took a dominant chord and replaced it with a series of chords on the descending circle of fifths. So in the key of E flat, we could back up to G minor 7, C minor 7, F minor 7, and then B flat 7. And so this circular progression serves as a replacement for this first ending. Another thing we can do is we can take each of these chords that are minor in quality and substitute a different quality. The quality that we'll try to substitute is the dominant quality. So instead of G minor 7, we'll try G7. Of course, that would be a secondary dominant. It would serve as a 5 chord of the next chord. This is a 5 of the C minor 7. I could do the same thing here. I could call that a C7, which would be the 5 of the F minor 7, or this could be F7. That would be the 5 of the B flat 7. Now remember, it's the chord scales that guide us in trying to make sure that the melody note is going to match whatever chord we put here. We learned that with the dominant chords, the only melody notes that wouldn't fit would be the perfect 4th and major 7th above the chord root tone. And even the 4th could fit if you change the chord to a suspended, like a G7 sus. In this example, there are no conflicts with the dominant chords and the given melody. Now I've got a choice of varieties of chord qualities for each of these places in this turnaround. So watch what I can do. I can, of course, proceed straight across, or I can use my substitutes, starting here, here, all dominant chords. Remember, these will all go to the E flat chord. Or I could zigzag. In other words, I could start here on the minor 7, go up here to the C7, back to the F minor 7, and continue forward. Or I could start here, the G7, cut across to the C minor 7, then the F7, and then the B flat 7 and forward. Or whatever combination I'd like. For example, I could do this, G7, C7, F minor 7, or G minor 7, C7, F7, B flat. You see, there's quite a bit of variety. As long as I follow the lines forward, a lot of choices here. I'm going to add another string of possibilities here, and these are going to be tritones. But before I do that, let's talk a little bit about tritone substitution. A tritone is an interval, either a augmented 4th or a diminished 5th, or you could get it by counting 6 half steps or 3 whole steps. That's where the word tritone comes from. If you write a dominant 7 chord, like a C7 chord, and then another dominant 7 chord a tritone away, such as this F sharp 7 chord, they are extremely similar. There are 2 notes that are enharmonically the same, the E and the B flat or A sharp. With a little sleight of hand, we can alter just one note and make the chords completely the same enharmonically. We'll change each chord to a dominant 7 chord flat 5. Watch this. Now notice that they are in essence identical. They both have a C, an E, a G flat or F sharp, and an A sharp or B flat. The implication here is that whenever you have a dominant 7 chord, you could substitute in a different dominant 7 chord that's a tritone away. Okay, now that we know what tritone substitution is, let's go ahead and apply that. So for each chord that I see, I'm going to consider a different chord that is a tritone away. Instead of G7, I'm going to consider a D flat 7 chord. Instead of C7, I'll consider a G flat 7 chord. Tritone away. Instead of F7, we'll try B7. Instead of B flat 7, we'll try E7. So notice you have to get good at your tritones. You have to know what notes are a tritone away in order for this to work. And then once I have this string of chords, I can do exactly what I did down here. I can, of course, move across. Or I can zigzag. So for example, I could start on the G7, go to the G flat, go to the F7, go to the E, and then the E flat. Do you notice that if I do that, then I end up actually with a chromatically descending set of chords? G, G flat, F, E, E flat. I can also do that by starting on the D flat. So for example, D flat, cut across to the C7, up to the B7, and here I'm going to actually go down to the B flat 7 and then finish on E flat. Again, I've got a chromatically descending group of chords that should work pretty well. D flat 7, C7, B7, B flat 7, E flat. And just as I discussed down here, you can actually just make a choice for each beat here. You can decide which one you want to do. Maybe D flat 7 here, maybe G flat 7 here, and maybe switch down to F7 here and up to E7, or G7, G flat 7, B7, B flat 7, whichever chord that you like. You have lots of different possibilities to create chord progressions. And finally, the last thing I'd like to consider is that instead of using the tritone chords as substitutes, you can actually use them as enhancing chords. In other words, you can go from a chord to its substitute. So from G7 to the D flat 7, I'll put it right here, and then back to the C7, and then go to its substitute chord, the G flat 7, and then to the F7, and then go to its substitute chord, B7, to the B flat 7, and then follow the B flat 7 chord with its substitute, E7, and then on to E flat. So I have a very interesting enhanced progression in which every beat of the measure gets its own chord, not by substituting, but by staggering the tritone substitutes in between the chords, and I get a very long enhanced progression. Let's give that a listen. Now that we have all these choices, we have to make some decisions. So I'm going to go ahead and pick some chords to use for my first ending here. I'm going to go from the D flat 7 to the C7 to the F minor 7, then the B7, B flat 7, and then E flat. And I'm going to go ahead and show you how I'm voicing that out. So my first chord is D flat 7, sharp 11, flat 9. That's a nice voicing because it's a G triad in the right hand. The only rule I'm going by is I need to have at least a third and a seventh, and then I can add whatever tensions that I want to add above that. I can even leave out the root tone if I had a bass player, but in this case I'm going to add the root tones in. The next chord is C7, sharp 9, flat 9. So I'm going to move from the sharp 9 to the flat 9 because that's always a nice little combination. The F minor 9 is a pretty straightforward voicing. The B7, I'm going to add a sharp 9 and a sharp 5. That's a really nice voicing because it allows me to put a fourth chord in the right hand, A, D, G. And then for the B flat 7 chord, I'm going to start with a sus chord, that's with the E flat, so that I can move into the B flat 7, flat 9. The E flat will move to D, the C will move to C flat. So let's go ahead and see what that sounds like. Now, as promised, I'd like to go back and reharmonize the very first measure of this piece. I'm not going to take so much time in doing it, and I'm not going to explain quite as much detail, but I will go through and review the different methods that we used. First, this piece, even though it starts in the key of E flat, does make a gesture in a rather serious way to the key of A flat. We can see the dominant chord, E flat 7. So I'm going to use the circle of fifths in the key of A flat to provide my first row of reharmonized chords. I'll back up on the circle and start with, in the key of A flat, chord number 3, which is C minor 7, and then proceed along the circle, F minor 7, B flat minor 7, E flat 7, back to A flat. As we did before, I can provide substitute chords in which each chord is replaced with a dominant chord. Here, C7, F7, B-flat 7, E-flat 7. Already that provides us with a lot of variety. But let's keep going. Let's add another string with our tritone substitutions. So instead of C7, F-sharp 7. Instead of F7, B7. For the B-flat 7, E7. For the E-flat 7, A7. And as we learned, we can also stagger the tritone subs. So C7 goes to F-sharp 7, goes to F7, to B7, to B-flat 7, to E7, to E-flat 7, to A7, to A-flat. Now, because I have to play this first measure of this piece 3 different times, I'm going to use actually 3 different reharmonizations. The very first one I'm going to keep quite simple. I'll start with the E-flat chord, move to the F minor 7, B-flat minor 7, E-flat 7, and then A-flat. The second time through, I'll change a few more things. I'll start with a C minor 7, move to the B7, the E7, the E-flat 7, and then the A-flat. Of course, I'll enhance those chords with a few extra tensions. And finally, because we know that when we use these subs, you can follow a path in which the chords are simply moving down chromatically, as we showed before. In other words, C7 could move to B7, could move to B-flat 7, and then could move to A7, and then to A-flat. You can extend that principle and use what I call chromatic linear progression, in which you just work out backwards how many half steps you want to use and write a chord progression that is simply moving down in half steps. So for example, if I know that my object chord is A-flat in the second measure, I'm just going to work out a chromatic scale backwards for each 8th note of the melody of that pentatonic scale leading up to it. So that would be A, B-flat, B, C, D-flat, D, and of course the first chord is E-flat. I'm going to provide a dominant chord for each of those chord qualities, so that would be D7, D-flat 7, C7, but we do have a little problem with the B, because the melody note is B-flat. That is a major 7th interval, and the B7 will simply not fit on that note. So I'm going to use a different quality. I will use a B diminished with a major 7th, which actually sounds quite nice. The B-flat, I can use B-flat 7. The A, I can use A7. And I'm going to go ahead and use that chord progression to lead to the A-flat. Actually, I've enhanced the chords just a little bit. That D7 is actually a D13 flat 9. The D-flat 7 has a flat 5. The C7 has a sharp 9. As I said, the B diminished has a major 7. The B-flat 7, I'm using a 9 and a sus4. And the A7, I'm using a 13 and a sharp 11. So here now is a complete reharmonization. I've incorporated the measures that we went over, and I also reharmonized the rest of the piece using similar methods that we went over together.